My family is having a complete meltdown because I didn't invite them to my wedding, but they conveniently forgot that they didn't invite me to any of theirs. 7 weddings. 7 times I was told I was too young, too immature, that their special day was for adults only. 7 times I watched from the sidelines as a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-old girl, while my entire family celebrated without me. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. They're sitting in my living room right now, demanding explanations, calling me petty and vindictive, acting like I've destroyed the family over nothing. But when I was just a kid who wanted to see her big sister walk down the aisle, suddenly weddings were no kids allowed events that I was too immature to understand. Here's the kicker. I'm not even their real sister. I found out 2 years ago that I'm actually their cousin raised by my aunt and uncle after my parents died. That explains why I was always treated differently. Always the odd one out. Always the one who didn't quite belong at family celebrations. But now I'm 24, planning my dream wedding, and I've got my own guest list to control. They spent years teaching me that family celebrations can exclude people based on arbitrary rules, so I decided to create my own rule: no hypocrites allowed. The best part, I'm not even having a traditional wedding anymore. After seeing how they're reacting to being excluded, my fiancé and I decided to elope next month. They'll find out about my marriage the same way I found out about most of their major life events, through social media posts after the fact. They taught me that some people just don't make the cut for family celebrations. Now they're about to learn what that actually feels like. Their own rules finally taught them how it feels. To understand why this situation is so satisfying, you need to know what it was like growing up as the baby in my family. There's a 15-year age gap between me and my oldest sister, 12 years, between me and my oldest brother, and 10 years between me and the twins. By the time I was old enough to have opinions about family events, they were all adults with their own lives, their own friends, and their own ideas about what was appropriate for family gatherings. I wasn't their little sister. I was their burden. The kid who needed supervision at restaurants, who might get tired during long events, who could potentially embarrass them in front of their sophisticated adult friends. When they planned their lives, I was always an afterthought, something to be managed rather than included. Being the baby of the family meant being left out. But it wasn't just weddings that I was excluded from. Family dinners at fancy restaurants. Too late for kids. Holiday parties with extended family. You'd be bored with all the adult conversation. Weekend trips to wine country or expensive resorts. Not really a kid-friendly destination. Even birthday celebrations moved to venues and times that conveniently excluded me. I spent most of my childhood watching my family live their lives without me. They'd post photos on social media of their fun family bonding time while I stayed home with a babysitter or got shipped off to spend the weekend with my grandmother. The pattern was so consistent that I started to think it was normal for families to have separate adult and child tiers. It wasn't just weddings, it was everything. The phrase I heard most often growing up was "no kids rule." It became the family motto, the easy solution to any event where my presence might be inconvenient. Planning a dinner party. No kids rule. Going to a concert. No kids rule. Having a celebration that required any level of sophistication or adult behavior. No kids rule. They explained it to me like it was a kindness. "Sweetie, you'd be bored," they'd say. "These events are for grown-ups. You'll understand when you're older." They made it sound like they were protecting me from something unpleasant, rather than excluding me from family memories. The no kids rule became their excuse for everything. But they never explained why other families managed to include their children in celebrations, or why cousins my age from other parts of the family somehow didn't disrupt events with their presence. It was specifically me who was always too young, too immature, too much of a risk to their perfect adult atmosphere. They said kids don't belong at adult celebrations. The moment that defined everything happened when I was 12 years old. My oldest sister announced her engagement, and I was genuinely excited. I'd never been to a wedding before, but I'd seen them in movies and on TV. I imagined wearing a fancy dress, watching her walk down the aisle, maybe even being a junior bridesmaid, or at least sitting with the family during the ceremony. For months, I listened to wedding planning conversations around the dinner table, venue options, dress shopping guest list discussions, menu tastings. I asked questions about what role I might have, what I should wear, whether I'd get to dance at the reception. Everyone smiled and gave vague answers about how special the day would be. 3 weeks before the wedding, I asked my sister directly when we were going shopping for my dress. That's when she sat me down in her old bedroom and explained the situation with that particular tone adults use when they're about to disappoint a child but want to sound reasonable about it. "Sweetie Tom and I have decided to have an adults-only wedding," she said. "It's going to be a very formal, sophisticated event, and we think it's better if it's just grown-ups. You understand, right?" I didn't understand. I was 12, not 2. I could sit quietly, I could behave appropriately, I could handle formal events without causing disruption. But none of that mattered. I wasn't invited to my own sister's wedding. The family's explanation for excluding me was a masterclass in gaslighting disguised as concern. Mom sat me down later that evening to reinforce my sister's decision, with all the classic phrases I'd hear repeated for years afterward. "This is really for your own good," she said. "Weddings can be very long and boring for children. You'd probably fall asleep during the ceremony, or get restless during the reception. And think about how you'd feel being the only kid there while all the adults are talking about grown-up things." Dad chimed in with his own version. "Your sister wants her wedding day to be perfect, and having to worry about entertaining a child would be stressful for her. When you're older, you'll understand that some events are just meant for adults." The twins, who were 22 at the time, nodded along like they were ancient wisdom keepers instead of barely adults themselves. "It's not personal," one of them said. "It's just how weddings work when you want them to be classy." They said it was for my own good. 2 years later, my oldest brother announced his engagement, and I foolishly thought things might be different this time. I was 14 now, practically a teenager. Surely I was old enough to attend a family wedding without causing some kind of sophisticated atmosphere crisis. I'd learned not to get too excited. But I still held on to a small hope that maybe the no kids rule had been specific to my sister's vision of her perfect day. Maybe my brother and his fiancée would be more inclusive. Maybe being 2 years older would make the difference. It didn't. 3 months before the wedding, I casually asked my brother if I'd be invited this time. He looked genuinely surprised that I'd even ask, like the idea of including me had never crossed his mind. "Oh, we're doing adults only too," he said. "Sarah really wants an elegant evening celebration, and you know how kids can be at those kinds of events. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. As if systematically excluding your 14-year-old sister from major family milestones could ever be anything other than deeply personal. At 14, I was still considered a kid. The twins got engaged when I was 16, both of them. They decided to have a double wedding ceremony, which meant twice the exclusion for the same reason. By this point, I wasn't even surprised when they announced their adults-only policy. I'd come to expect it. What stung was how automatic the decision seemed. They didn't wrestle with whether to include me or consider if maybe a 16-year-old could handle a wedding reception. They just defaulted to the family rule, no kids allowed, and I was permanently categorized as a kid, regardless of my actual age or maturity level. "We want to keep things simple," one of the twins explained, when I asked if there was any possibility of being included. Having to worry about accommodating younger family members would just complicate things. Accommodating, like I was a dietary restriction or accessibility need rather than their sister who wanted to celebrate with them. Even at 16, the rule never changed. But something else was starting to bother me beyond just the wedding exclusions. I began noticing that my treatment wasn't just about age. It was about something deeper that no one wanted to acknowledge. Other 16-year-olds in our extended family attended weddings. Cousins my age were included in family photos at these events. Friends of my siblings brought their teenage siblings to celebrations without it being considered a sophisticated atmosphere emergency. It was specifically me who always seemed to be too young, too immature, too much of a risk to include. The rule wasn't really about kids. It was about me. I started paying attention to family conversations more carefully, picking up on references and inside jokes that I wasn't part of. Comments about family history that didn't quite make sense. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Something felt different about how they treated me. The truth came out during a family argument when I was 18. I'd finally gotten fed up with being treated differently and confronted my parents about why I was always excluded from everything important. The conversation got heated, voices were raised, and in a moment of frustration, my mom let something slip that changed everything. "You just don't understand how complicated this situation has been for us," she snapped. "We've been doing our best to raise you after what happened to your parents, but it's not like you're actually—" She stopped mid-sentence, realizing what she was about to say. The room went completely silent. My dad's face went pale. My siblings, who were visiting for the weekend, suddenly found the floor very interesting. "Not like I'm actually what?" I asked quietly. After 20 minutes of uncomfortable silence and hushed conversations between my parents, they finally told me the truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their niece. My real parents, my mom's sister and her husband, had died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, and my aunt and uncle had taken me in. Everyone knew except me. My siblings knew. Extended family knew. Family friends knew. I was the only person in my own life who didn't know my actual identity. I wasn't their sister. I was their cousin. Suddenly, everything made sense. The different treatment, the constant exclusion, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. I wasn't being excluded because I was too young or immature. I was being excluded because I wasn't really family, and nobody wanted to deal with the awkwardness of that truth. My siblings had never seen me as their sister. I was the cousin they got stuck with when my parents died, the obligation their parents took on out of duty rather than love. The no kids rule wasn't about protecting sophisticated atmospheres. It was about maintaining family boundaries that didn't include me. When they planned their weddings, they weren't thinking about their little sister, who might be hurt by exclusion. They were thinking about the cousin who wasn't really part of their core family unit, whose presence would require explanation to people who might not know our family's complicated history. The exclusion was never about my age. Looking back with this new information, every interaction made perfect sense. The way they talked about family traditions that somehow never applied to me. The way they made decisions about family events without considering my feelings or input. The way they posted about family milestones on social media without acknowledging my absence. I wasn't being excluded from family celebrations because I was a child. I was being excluded because they had never really considered me family in the first place. The age excuse was just convenient cover for the uncomfortable truth that they'd been othering me for my entire conscious life. Every birthday where I was the only one who didn't get to bring friends to dinner. Every holiday where I was assigned different responsibilities than my siblings. Every family photo where I was positioned slightly apart from the main group. It wasn't about maturity or sophistication or appropriate venues for children. It was about maintaining emotional distance from the kid they'd inherited rather than chosen. Every exclusion suddenly made perfect sense. Once I knew the truth, I wasn't going to let them continue pretending that my exclusion had been about age or appropriateness. I demanded a family meeting where everyone had to sit in the same room and explain exactly why they'd been lying to me for 18 years. The conversation was brutal. My parents tried to frame their decision as protective, claiming they thought it would be easier for me to grow up thinking I was their biological daughter. My siblings defended their wedding choices by saying they didn't want to make family gatherings weird by having to explain our complicated family structure to their friends. We thought it would be less confusing for everyone, my sister said, not meeting my eyes. Less confusing for who? I shot back. Because I've been confused my entire life about why I was treated differently. That's when my oldest brother made the mistake of being honest. Look, it's not that we don't care about you, but our real family relationships are different. Our friends know us as having two brothers and a sister, not this situation. Real family relationships. He actually said that out loud. They admitted I was never really family. I spent the next week going through 18 years of family history, with new eyes documenting every instance of exclusion and different treatment. 7 weddings I wasn't invited to. Dozens of family dinners I was excluded from. Countless holiday celebrations where I was either not invited or treated as an afterthought. Family photos where I was positioned at the edge or completely absent. Social media posts about sibling bonding time that happened while I was at school or staying with relatives. Vacation planning that somehow never included checking if I was available or interested. I made a list of every missed event, every exclusion, every time I was told I was too young, too immature, too inappropriate for family celebrations. The pattern was undeniable once I laid it all out chronologically. 7 years of exclusion, all perfectly documented. When I presented this timeline to my family, their response was exactly what I expected. Instead of acknowledging the harm they'd caused, they immediately went into damage control mode with all the classic gaslighting phrases. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be," my mom said. "We were just trying to do what was best for everyone." "It's not like we meant to hurt your feelings," one of the twins added. "You're being overly sensitive about things that happened when you were a kid." My sister tried a different approach. "We can't change the past, but we're family now. Why can't we just move forward and stop dwelling on old hurts?" Old hurts. As if 18 years of systematic exclusion was just something I should get over, because it was inconvenient for them to deal with. They said I was making too big a deal. That's when I realized something important. They weren't sorry about how they'd treated me. They were sorry that I'd figured out the truth and was making them uncomfortable about it. They wanted to go back to the way things were, where I accepted exclusion as normal and didn't ask difficult questions about family dynamics. But I was 24 years old now, planning my own wedding, and finally in a position to make my own rules about family celebrations. If they could spend years teaching me that some people don't belong at important family events, then I could apply that same logic to my own life. My fiancé supported whatever decision I wanted to make about the guest list. He'd watched me struggle with feeling like an outsider in my own family for years. When I told him I was considering excluding my siblings from our wedding, he didn't try to talk me out of it or suggest I take the high road. If that's what you need to do to protect yourself and start our marriage on your terms," he said, "then that's what we'll do. If their rules worked for them, they'd work for me." Planning my wedding became an exercise in deliberate exclusion, and I have to admit, it felt amazing. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one making decisions about who belonged at a family celebration and who didn't. I was the one setting the rules, choosing the atmosphere, deciding what kind of energy I wanted at my most important life event. My fiancé and I spent months planning every detail, without considering my family's preferences, schedule, or expectations. We chose a venue they'd never been to, picked a date without checking if it worked for them, selected a menu that reflected our tastes rather than accommodating their dietary preferences. It was liberating to plan something major without having to think about their comfort, their opinions, or their approval. Every decision we made was about what would make us happy, not what would keep the peace with people who had spent years making me feel unwelcome at their celebrations. I planned my dream wedding without them. The guest list was where I really had fun with the concept of exclusion. I invited college friends, work colleagues, my fiancé's entire extended family, high school acquaintances I'd reconnected with on social media, and even some family friends, who had always treated me kindly despite knowing I wasn't my parents' biological daughter. But when it came to my siblings and parents, I experienced the same selective memory they'd always shown when planning their events. Somehow their names just didn't make it onto the guest list. Oops, I knew they'd eventually figure out they weren't invited, and I knew they'd be furious when they did. I'd lived with these people for 18 years. I understood their personalities, their triggers, their capacity for righteous indignation when things didn't go their way. They would definitely consider my exclusion of them to be a personal attack, a vindictive overreaction, a cruel punishment that went too far. They'd probably use words like petty and immature and disappointing. They'd frame themselves as the victims of my unreasonable anger. But I'd spent years watching them justify their own exclusions with sophisticated-sounding reasons and family-first rhetoric. I'd listened to them explain why their wedding visions didn't include me without ever acknowledging that exclusion might hurt. Now, it was their turn to experience what that felt like. I knew they'd be furious, and I was ready. The invitations went out 6 weeks before the wedding. Beautiful, expensive cardstock with elegant calligraphy sent to everyone who mattered to us, and nobody who had spent years teaching me that I didn't matter to them. I mailed invitations to my fiancé's aunts and uncles, to friends from different phases of our lives, to coworkers who had become genuine friends. I even sent one to my grandmother, who had always been kind to me, and had actually expressed disapproval about my exclusion from family events over the years. But the mailman didn't deliver any wedding invitations to my parents' house or to any of my siblings' addresses. Their mailboxes remained disappointingly empty of elegant wedding stationery. I waited for the phone calls to start. I waited for the confused text messages asking if their invitations had gotten lost in the mail. I waited for someone to reach out and ask about wedding details or offer to help with planning. Days passed, then weeks. The silence was actually more satisfying than I'd expected. The invitations went out, just not to them. The phone call came exactly 5 weeks before my wedding date. My sister's voice was tight with confusion and barely contained irritation when I answered. "Hey, I think there might be some kind of mix-up with your wedding invitations," she said, clearly trying to sound casual. "I haven't received mine yet, and Mom and Dad haven't gotten theirs either." "Did you send them to our old addresses by mistake?" "No mix-up," I said calmly. "You didn't get invitations because you're not invited." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she exploded. "What do you mean we're not invited? We're your family. You can't have a wedding without your family." "Actually, I can. It's my wedding, so I get to decide who comes. Just like you gotta decide I couldn't come to yours." Within 2 hours, my entire family was standing in my living room. My parents, my sister, both brothers, all demanding explanations and looking at me like I'd lost my mind. My mom kept saying there had to be some misunderstanding, that I couldn't possibly mean to exclude them from my wedding. They showed up at my door, demanding answers. I sat in my own chair in my own living room and gave them exactly what they'd given me for years, a calm explanation of why they didn't make the cut for my celebration. "I've decided to have an adults-only wedding," I said, using the exact same tone they'd used on me. "You know how kids can be at these kinds of events. I want a sophisticated, elegant celebration, and having to worry about accommodating family members who might not understand appropriate behavior would just complicate things." My oldest brother stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "But we're adults. What are you talking about?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to say I'm having a mature adults-only wedding. You know people who understand that when you exclude someone from your important life events, there might be consequences. People who don't spend years lying to family members about their identity. People who actually consider my feelings when making decisions about family celebrations." I used their exact words back at them. The backpedaling started immediately. Suddenly, all the justifications they'd used to exclude me were completely unreasonable when applied to them. "That's completely different," my sister said. "Wedding exclusions based on age make sense. What you're doing is just vindictive." "Different how?" I asked. "You excluded me for being too young. I'm excluding you for being too immature to treat family members with basic respect. We were protecting you from boring adult events." My mom tried. "You're punishing us out of spite." My dad jumped in with the classic guilt trip. "This is supposed to be a day about bringing family together, not tearing it apart. Your grandparents would be devastated if they knew you were doing this." It was amazing how quickly their sophisticated reasoning disappeared when they were the ones being excluded. Age-based exclusion had been totally reasonable when it kept me out of their celebrations, but personality-based exclusion was suddenly cruel and unfair when it applied to them. Suddenly, their rules didn't seem so fair. I stood up and walked to my desk, where I'd prepared a folder full of documentation for exactly this moment. Photos of their weddings that I wasn't in. Social media posts about family celebrations that happened without me. A timeline of every exclusion, every moment they'd chosen to prioritize their comfort over my inclusion. "Let me remind you how this works," I said, spreading the papers across my coffee table. "For 18 years, you excluded me from family events. 7 weddings, dozens of dinners, countless celebrations. You lied about who I was, treated me like an outsider in my own home, and gaslit me into thinking the exclusion was for my own good." I picked up a photo from my sister's wedding where the family posed without me. "You taught me that some people just don't belong at important family events. You taught me that the person planning the celebration gets to decide who makes the cut. You taught me that family gatherings can have arbitrary rules that exclude people based on whatever criteria the hosts choose." My mom was crying now, but I wasn't done. "You taught me that when someone doesn't fit your vision of a perfect family celebration, you just leave them out and come up with a reasonable-sounding excuse later. So that's what I'm doing. You don't fit my vision of a perfect wedding celebration, so you're not invited." I looked around the room at their shocked faces. Congratulations. After years of teaching me these lessons, I finally learned them perfectly. They created the rules, now they live by them. After that confrontation, the harassment started immediately. Phone calls, text messages, emails from extended family members who had been recruited to guilt me into changing my mind. Everyone had an opinion about how I was handling the situation, and most of those opinions involved me being the bigger person and forgiving my family for their years of exclusion. My grandmother called to tell me how disappointed she was that I would break up the family over ancient history. The cousins I barely spoke to reached out on social media to lecture me about forgiveness and family loyalty. Even family friends started weighing in with their thoughts about how I should handle my own wedding guest list. The pressure was intense, but it clarified something important for me. These people had watched my family exclude me for years without saying a word. They'd attended weddings where I was conspicuously absent without questioning why a 12, 14, or 16-year-old wasn't allowed to celebrate with her family. But now that I was applying the same exclusionary logic to the people who had created it, suddenly everyone was concerned about family unity and the importance of forgiveness. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and it made my decision easy. I chose to elope and leave them all behind. 2 weeks before my original wedding date, my fiancé and I drove to a courthouse 3 states away and got married with 2 witnesses we'd never met before. No family drama, no emotional manipulation, no pressure to include people who had spent years teaching me I didn't belong at family celebrations. It was perfect. Simple, honest, focused entirely on us and our commitment to each other. No one there had a hidden agenda or a complicated history of exclusion and lies. No one was attending out of obligation or social expectation. We took photos with our random witnesses, went to dinner at a restaurant we'd never been to, and spent our wedding night in a hotel room laughing about how peaceful everything felt, without my family's drama poisoning the atmosphere. 6 months later, I posted our wedding photos on social media. Just a simple announcement. We eloped thanks to everyone who taught us that family celebrations work better when you only invite people who actually want to be there. The comment section was interesting. Lots of congratulations from friends who understood the situation. Radio silence. From my immediate family, a few passive-aggressive comments from relatives about how sad it was that family couldn't work things out. But you know what was missing from the comments. Any acknowledgement that my family had spent years applying the exact same exclusionary logic to me. Any recognition that I'd simply given them back the energy they'd been giving me since childhood. They wanted to be victims of my cruelty, not accept responsibility for teaching me that some people just don't belong at family celebrations. 6 months after that, my brother reached out to tell me my mom wanted to repair our relationship. Apparently, she missed having me in her life and regretted how things had been handled. I told him she was welcome to miss me. I'd spent 18 years missing my family too, wondering why I was never quite included, never quite important enough to accommodate in their celebration planning. Now I had a husband who prioritized my feelings, friends who included me in their lives without conditions, and a chosen family that treated me like I belonged. I didn't need the approval of people who had taught me that love comes with exclusions, and family membership has to be earned through accepting mistreatment. Their own rules finally taught them how it feels.